least there's still a few seats up in the front, and maybe if people can point out, it is wonderful to see such a packed room. I don't think I've ever seen the front row quite so full, which is a testament to our speaker this evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Department of History's 2018 Faculty Lecture and Holiday Party. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the people who brought this event together. Untitled Chapter, the convener of our departmental seminar series, Cindy Fair for all her organizational work, and the staff more broadly. One of the great pleasures of this event that we hold annually is the opportunity it provides to listen to our colleagues talk. Not about the latest departmental initiatives, not about the faculty's strategic plan, not even about the state of the humanities. But about the core of what it is that we do here at Queen's, and that is research. As department chair, the department chair is tasked with introductions, it's also an opportunity to appreciate anew the depth and the quality of the research produced within our midst. And this is exemplified by this evening's speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce friend and colleague, Dr. Barrington Walker. Barrington received his PhD from the University of Toronto in 2003, 1 year after being hired ABD by the Department of History at Queen's. The tremendous promise that Barrington clearly showed at this very early juncture in his career has been amply borne out. Barrington now stands as one of the country's leading scholars in the histories of race and the Black experience in Canada. His scholarship addresses not only the history of racism in Canada, but the centrality of race to Canadian modernity, to both state practices and to our identity as a nation. His scholarship blends theoretical sophistication and an engagement with theory with very thorough empirical research, grounded in archives and other types of sources. In his first book, his monograph, Race on Trial, Black Defendants in Ontario's Criminal Courts, 1858 to 1958, which was published by the University of Toronto Press and the Osgood Society for Canadian Legal History in 2010, Barrington presented the courts and the domain of the law more broadly as a key locus for the articulation and contestation of race in Canada. More broadly, he explored the way the trials and the treatment of Black defendants in these trials emerged as important moments in the way Canada defined itself as a nation. Offering a close reading of criminal cases spanning a century, the book established Barrington as a preeminent scholar of both Black Canadian history and legal history. The book was shortlisted for the Legislature Assembly of Ontario Speaker's Book Award in 2012, and I think that speaks to its importance in the sort of legal, historical context. Barrington's scholarship is also deeply enmeshed with the history of immigration in Canada. In 2008, he edited a volume on the history of immigration and racism in Canada, Essential Readings. This was followed a number of years later by another edited volume, The African Canadian Legal Odyssey, Historical Essays, which was published also by the Osgood Society and the University of Toronto Press. More recently, Barrington was commissioned by Oxford University Press to write a book on the Canadian history of race and immigration, Colonizing Nation, which is currently in progress and I think certainly more than halfway done. These publications, I think, in their entirety, reflect the important role and the crucial role that Barrington has played in centering the history of race within Canadian history. His stature in the field of Black history and in the field of legal history is amply apparent in the truly astonishing number of keynote addresses and invited lectures that he has given over the last few years alone at conferences and symposia across the country and in some of the country's preeminent leading law schools. As historians, we're increasingly compelled to reflect on what the histories we research, the histories we write, can say to our current predicament, to our current contemporary situation. Barrington has embraced this challenge. And most recently, if you look at our Twitter feed, you will see that he was interviewed on the CBC. It's very unfortunate, I think, that the subject of his research remains as relevant as it is today, but we're very fortunate that we have Barrington to elucidate the histories that speak so powerfully to our current situation. In addition to his research, Barrington is an accomplished teacher and a dedicated teacher at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, a committed graduate supervisor, and a wonderful colleague. I hope this evening Barrington will be addressing critical histories of Blackness in Canada, so please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight.
So before I begin, I'd just like to thank the department for bestowing this honor upon me. Having the opportunity to share some of my research with treasured colleagues and students and friends is something that I deeply appreciate, and I'm also humbled by the turnout. This meditative paper considers how we might continue to go about the difficult task of writing critical histories of Blackness in Canada and what that might entail. Here I want to highlight the various issues at stake in thinking about historical scholarship as critical practice by attempting to work through a number of issues in the time and the space provided here. As we write our histories of Blacks in Canada, who exactly should we remember and why? If narrative is a process through which nations realize and imagine themselves, where do Black people fit into this project? Put another way, what exactly is the relationship between Blackness and this settler colony that we inhabit? This space that has had many different names, including and originally Turtle Island, that we now call Canada. And more specifically, what is the particular positionality of Black people within the histories of settler colonialisms and its ongoing modes of colonial governance vis-a-vis Canada's Indigenous peoples? In attempting to answer these questions, perhaps not in quite the order that I have presented them here, I will consider the existing historiography, much of which has been written with these critical questions in mind. In addition, I will consider the possibilities for the historiography that is to come, how we might envision the sorts of critical Black histories we will write in the future. I argue that writing critical Black histories must continue to emphasize the move beyond simple storytelling that is all too prevalent during public historical commemorative events that characterize a typical Black History Month fair. And Black History Month, I'm already starting to get my inbox invitations for Black History Month. And although it is rare, can still also function as a kind of strategic retreat for some professional university-trained and or employed historians, as well as their so-called amateur counterparts. Such a retreat tragically and needlessly cedes the ground of Black criticality to newer disciplines whose grasp of the complexity of Black histories in Canada can at times, I mean any insult to my friends in the audience, be superficial, bereft of historical or historiographical nuance. Part one of this paper deals with questions of historiography and sketches a few of the major approaches that have shaped the field of African Canadian history over the past 50 years. Part two turns to questions of theory and method in the writing of African Canadian history, and part three discusses how we might move towards a critical history of Black people and the racial state, focusing on three historical case studies drawn from the 19th century. I would like to begin my discussion with two early narrative history texts, both of which were important general surveys of Black Canadian history. These are classic texts, but their importance has certainly not diminished with age and over time. The first was Robin Winks's The Blacks in Canada, a History, first penned in the late 1960s and republished in the 1990s by McGill Queen's University Press, our very own press here. The second is Dan Hill's The Freedom Seekers, a textbook that was written in the 1980s. Winks's book, all 500 plus pages of it, is a work that has tended to inspire mixed reactions. As I have discussed elsewhere, this book, though it was based on an astounding research effort, seems to have been met with what can only be described as a resounding thud by the Canadian historical profession when it was first published. For a book that essentially formally opened up a sub-discipline in Canadian history, the response was rather curious. It didn't spark the sort of intellectual ferment or create the institutional spaces within the Canadian Academy that might have been expected. This was the case, I believe, for two reasons. First, Winks was writing into a scholarly void that existed precisely because of the overwhelming whiteness of the Canadian historical profession and its blindness with regard to a critical engagement with Black histories in Canada. The writing of the history of Blacks in Canada, although it had a relatively long history, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, was simply not deemed important nor worthy of serious study when Winks published his book. I met this sort of attitude head-on when in the early 1990s I was on the cusp of completing a master's degree at the University of Toronto. And at that time I was rather generously granted a meeting with one of the leading historians of Canada in one of the country's most respected departments. In response to my query about the possibility of pursuing a doctorate in his department and writing a dissertation of Black Canadian history, I was politely informed by my well-meaning host that writing such a dissertation would prove difficult because the history of Blacks in Canada was virtually non-existent, and by extension, irrelevant. I was thus encouraged, and it was not the first time I was to be met with such advice, to broaden my research to include other non-Anglo-Celtic groups in Canada. Winks's book received a somewhat chilly reception for another reason. When Canadians did think about the history of Black people in Canada, it was often in the vein of the celebratory histories written by an earlier generation of historians, most notably Fred Landon. Fred Landon was a University of Western Ontario-based historian and librarian, who was also a member of the interracial board of London's civil rights organization, the Canadian League for the Advancement of Colored People. So again, Landon was a rather prolific historian, having produced some 300 publications, many of which are on the history of Blacks in Canada. Indeed, Landon is regarded by many as the founder of the field in Black Canadian history. And his work was foundational in the sense that it was the first to professionalize the study of Blacks in Canada by disseminating his research in professional journals. His work on the history of Blacks in Canada, and he published widely on the history of Ontario beyond Black history, was solid, and it was based on the systematic and conscientious use of primary sources. One of my main bones of contention with Landon, however, was that much of his work, not all, mirrored some of the worst excesses of the Underground Railroad that was proffered by white abolitionists. As many of you undoubtedly know, the numerous publications that were produced by white abolitionists tended to rely on a number of rhetorical strategies with which we are still saddled. First, there was a tendency to trade in rather graphic accounts of the harsh treatment that was inflicted upon the bodies of slaves in order to generate empathy on the part of intended white audiences of these pamphlets. Saidiya Hartman, for example, has argued brilliantly in her work, Scenes of Subjection, that the discourse of empathy, the identification of the observer with the slave, ultimately reinforced white supremacy, while it facilitated the erasure of the subjectivity of the slave. Secondly, the abolitionists tended to relegate Blacks to the status of those acted upon, rather than as central actors in their story. The agency of Black people, the role that they took in seizing freedom, often went MIA in the work of abolitionists, and I'll say a little bit more about agency later. Third, their work tended to highlight the notion that Canada was a more or less pure haven from slavery. This work was mobilized to support a foundational historical narrative of white Canadian beneficence. It is the creation of a narrative arc that makes the nation, and this process sits at the intersection of knowledge, i.e. the archive, and power. Landon's work did not engage with the voyeuristic excesses of his abolitionist predecessors, but his work was quite resonant with it, at least on the last two fronts. So Robin Winks in The Blacks in Canada was the first critical response to the tradition represented by Landon and his white abolitionists, antecedents or predecessors. Winks's tome was an archival tour de force. His meticulous research was instructive from the standpoint of doing the important work of excavation for writing critical histories. Winks's work shows us that often the first step in writing good critical histories is premised upon the importance of empirical archival research, not as mere recovery and retrieval, but again as the first step en route to critical practice. So for Winks, the key to debunking the long-cherished myths of Canada as a haven from slavery and a promised land lay in the manuscript sources, what we historians also call primary research. And many others, including myself, have written elsewhere, Stories of Benevolence on the Underground Railroad in Canada was a welcoming terminus where blacks enjoyed freedom under the British flag. That is only part of the story. Winks's work smashed those myths with astonishing surgical precision. First, he highlighted the role of slavery in places like New France and during the Loyalist era, building on some of the work that a scholar named Trudel had done earlier in his seminal study of slavery in New France. And after charting the various ways in which slavery came to peter out due to a number of factors, economic, political, legal, and perhaps even social, Winks goes on to show us that the afterlife of slavery in Canada, he didn't use that term, but the aftermath of slavery in Canada was far from idyllic. In fact, quite to the contrary, the single most important contribution of Winks's work was that it made the case that whilst blacks enjoyed formal equality, they were subject to pervasive patterns of social and cultural discrimination. This took the form of residential segregation, separate and inferior schools, political and economic marginalization from the mainstream of political life, episodes of mob violence, and a popular culture that made the denigration of black people one of its central preoccupations. And these cultural products were both homegrown and imported from the torrent of such images being produced in the United States. So while Winks's empirical work freed the study of black people in Canada from the romantic myths about Canada, in other respects, his own work failed to live up to critical scrutiny. For the Canada that was narrated in Winks's book, while it was a bald rebuke of the Promised Land narrative, also served to inscribe a narrative of black subjection and abjection that often denied black Canadians their humanity. For all of its success in shattering the myth of Canadian racial tolerance, unfortunately, there is an undercurrent of white and liberal supremacy in that book that makes many of us uneasy. This is why many scholars no longer teach the book, and why, even amongst the handful of students who have made their way to my university to undertake the advanced study of race in Canada or Black Canadian history under my supervision, fewer and fewer seem to have grappled with this important book. Winks's portrayal of black Canadians was at times condescending, even insulting. To cite a famous example in his chapter on the black refugees of Nova Scotia, Winks wrote, "The refugee Negroes were a disorganized, pathetic, and intimidated body who seemed unable to recover from their previous condition of servitude. Their sudden voyage up the Atlantic to Nova Scotian shores and their persistent lack of leaders marked the community. They unwittingly fanned the sparks of more conscious, more organized white racism than Nova Scotia had known, just as the last vestiges of slavery were passing. These new arrivals clasped their freedom to them, willed themselves to do well, and did not want to leave their newfound land, and yet failed utterly." This is but one example in a tone that is rife with these sorts of sentiments and statements. Winks essentially concluded that black people in Canada were unsuccessful because by almost every objective measure, they were unable to match the successes of black people in the United States. Where US blacks were led by charismatic figures, black Canadians seemed leaderless. While these charismatic American black leaders embarked on a variety of programmatic responses to confront white racism in the US, ranging from Garveyism to civil rights, blacks in Canada seemed to lack a coherent organizing philosophy. And when these ideological currents did manage to trickle across the border, they failed to take root in the shallow soil of black Canadian life. In response to Winks's work, a number of scholars began to craft critical responses of their own. University of Waterloo historian James Walker criticized Winks for writing the history of blacks as an issue in white Canadian life, rather than the history of the Negro life in Canada. I've always only partially agreed with Jim's assessment of Winks's work on this score. I don't think you can disentangle black history from white supremacy. The idea of race and the emergence of the racial state, because the history of black people in the West is inextricably bound up with each of these things. It is a fact, nonetheless, that Winks's history did tend to reproduce the logic of racism by positioning black people as the passive recipients of white racial abuse. Indeed, his preference to the second edition of the Blacks in Canada, in his preface rather, Winks rather strangely remarked that one of the oblique stylistic interventions of the book was his decision to write his chapter on what he called the natter of the black experience, essentially his narrative account of what we would now call Canadian anti-black racism, in the passive voice. I have devoted this much attention to Winks because although it is a text that many in our field would like to see dead and buried, about a decade ago a colleague of mine criticized me for devoting time to a text that was over 30 years old at that time. Its influence continues to loom large, although this is often unacknowledged. After Winks, much of what followed in the writing of the History of Blacks in Canada built on his important excavation of white supremacy in Canada, while providing a critical response to many of the underlying assumptions in Winks's book around the place of blacks in shaping their own history, which he admitted was minimal, or which he argued was minimal. James Walker, again, in The Black Loyalists. This book was first published shortly after Winks published his work. Walker's influential work highlighted the role that black people had in forging their own freedom during the American Revolution. They were neither, he argued, the quote, flotsam and jetsam of imperial contests, nor the passive beneficiaries of British colonial policy. Walker argued that blacks forged their own freedom by seizing the opportunities that emerged during the war. They were not freed, but rather, they exercised their agency by freeing themselves. Other works written in the aftermath of Winks's work also endeavored to place black Canadians at the center of their history. Daniel G. Hill's The Freedom Seekers, Blacks in Early Canada, explicitly argued that freedom was not something that was conferred upon black people in Canada, but rather something that they actively sought out, forging it for themselves. This is most poignantly illustrated in the culminating chapter of his book, The Freedom Seekers, which provides sketches of 18 black Canadians, central historical figures who were the movers of early black Canadian history in his formulation. In a similar vein, in 1986, C. Peter Ripley's The Black Abolitionist Papers sought to, again, explicitly focus on the contributions in history of black abolitionists via an extensive introduction and a rich compendium of primary sources. The work is, in essence, an archive of black emancipatory thought and practice in the 19th century, one that sought to highlight black abolitionist thought in Canada as part of a larger movement that spanned Britain and the United States. The emergence of agency as a central theme in the history of black Canadians has been central in the subsequent work that has emerged in the 1990s and beyond. During this period, the decentering of black men in Canadian history also took hold, as black Canadian women's history also emerged during that time in the works of scholars such as Afua Cooper, Adrian Shadd, and Maureen Eldersman, to name but a few. Thus, for at least 2 decades now, much of the scholarly academic writing of critical black Canadian history has largely moved beyond the simple story and the mythologizing of Canada as a haven from slavery and discrimination. Although there have been some recent publications that seem to return to it in a noteworthy post-revisionist turn, that though avowedly atheoretical, is in fact heavily imbued with certain theoretical and ideological notions, which I can talk about later. In any case, what historians have turned to now is centering black people as the architects of their own history. But there are other issues that we need to consider when writing critical histories of blackness in Canada as well. And there are 3 things that I'm thinking of here. First, how do we move beyond histories of firsts and the sorts of celebratory histories that are often the result of them? And second, how do we think about black people's relationship to settler colonialism in Canada? And third, how the methodology of the historian can take up the methodological insights born of black feminist intersectional theory and practice and the modernist chronotopes that emerge out of slavery and its aftermath. So much of the writing of blacks in Canada has been preoccupied with the excavation of archives to unearth black firsts, And this is perfectly understandable given the history of white supremacy and the denigration of blackness that pervades so much of the lived experiences of black folks in the past, in the present, and very likely into the future. The focus on heroes in the writing and public dissemination of black histories is thus a predictable response to white supremacist assaults on black aesthetics, intelligence, and accomplishments. Thus, boilerplate Black History Month celebrations typically feature stories of black heroism or black accomplishment in a range of fields such as arts, law, science, literature, and even athletics. Though typically, in the pre-war era, as barriers to black participation in professional life and elite level sports have been torn down outside of a handful of vanilla sports such as golf and hockey. It is understandable, too, that these sorts of conventions would have found their way into some of the historical scholarship. As well, there has been an inordinate focus on exceptional elites, in large part a result of the challenges presented by finding sources that might point the way to lesser-known figures. While it is true that much of the preoccupation with black Canadian elites has to do with who has produced and left behind documentary evidence of their lives, there is also more going on in the decision that many historians of black Canada have made to focus on elites. If blacks are the agents of history, there is also a belief among many historians, both explicitly stated and not, that black elites, or those who are otherwise particularly accomplished, are the movers and creators of black Canadian history. And this is essentially a Du Boisian kind of talented 10th notion, or conception of black history, a holdover from older ideas of history and historical practice that emerged in the 19th century, and the Whiggish preoccupation with ideas of teleology and historical progress. Writing critical histories of blackness entails not eschewing the history of elites per se, but thinking more carefully and critically about their role in history. A critical approach to history alerts us to the fact that elites are a product of a given social, cultural, and economic context. Moreover, a critical approach to history demands that we also move away from our preoccupation with exemplary historical figures to look at the everyday lives of black men and women, most of whom were engaged in many of whom were engaged in various sorts of legal and illicit work, to get a sense of how they shape the contours of modern black history. Although we have a few excellent studies of slavery in Canada, very few studies of the Canadian black working class exist, not to mention the black underclass or lumpen proletariat. Nor do we have many studies of those who were enmeshed in the criminal justice system, which again is understandable given the historic power of dominant stereotypes of black criminality. The few historical studies that do exist, sociologists and criminologists have been more likely to take on these issues, are met with either a stony silence or criticized for reifying or trading in negative stereotypes, something with which I am personally familiar. But the criminal justice system and the mass incarceration of the prison industrial complex has had such an inordinate role in shaping black life after slavery that it warrants further attention. Indeed, we need more work that explores the genealogy of the prison and policing in Canada that links it to the Middle Passage and slavery. So this part of the paper, I'm going to turn to some remarks on theory, method, and black Canadian history. Writing black Canadian history involves the careful consideration of theory and method. So several questions arise. The first is how we want to do black Canadian history, and the second is exactly what we want this history to do for us. How are we going to go about the process of systematically remembering the black past, and what are the nature of the archives from which we can draw? How do we define the Black Canadian Archive, and what is our relationship to it? And how does writing black history in Canada open up new ways of thinking about the relationship between time and space? How should historians of black Canada address the issue of agency in the future? And this part of my conversation is deeply indebted to my friends in Black Studies who introduced me to a lot of work that I didn't know about. So rather than offer definitive answers, I would like to offer some tentative positions through which you might begin to respond to such questions. Writing Black Canadian history is the simultaneous practice of theory and method. Historians of Black Canada must double down on the tried and true counter-hegemonic strategies of the historian of the quintessential other, right, or the subaltern. She must be attuned to the strategies of reading against the grain, of the gaps and the silences, and the routinized, often banal violence of the records of officialdom. At the same time, we must expand the archive beyond traditional manuscript and oral history sources. To be sure, both are crucial to the writing of the histories of people who are steeped in a rich oral tradition. At the same time, I am gesturing to, and this is inspired by my PhD student, Daniel Meister, I'm gesturing to Black archival futurity, an archive that exists the limits of manuscript sources or oral histories. Black archival futurities will need to continue to mine the archive that is the Black body, a body that bears the weight of so much of our histories as Black people during slavery and its aftermath, and that is so often the focus of critical scholarship on Black histories, cultures, and experiences. The body's archive is contained, not only in the ways in which it has been surveilled, constructed, and interpolated, but also in the history of Black looks, gestures, gaits, and how the memory of slavery is embedded within and among them. Past scholars have read slave ads and their vivid descriptions of the infirmaries of runaway slaves as inventories of the violence that masters inflicted upon the bodies of slaves. Future historians may well look to the realms of bioarchaeologies, for example, and the traumas that are archived within us, quietly ticking away in mitochondrial DNA, literally collapsing the past and the present. But while the materiality of blood, bone, sinew, and mitochondria mark one potential path of archival futurities, historians will also have to grapple with digitized, disembodied, and artificially intelligent, algorithmic, and cybernetic expressions of Blackness and the Black modern. These archives can neither be reduced to the old notions of what Fanon called the bodily epidermal schema, nor can they be contained by the national or transnational frameworks upon which our prior work has been rooted. The historian will have to look for new sites of resistance and struggle vis-a-vis these new archival sites. And lastly and relatedly, I would like to say a little bit more about the question of agency, which I referenced in the first part of the presentation. Indeed, we must heed Paul Gilroy's observation in the Black Atlantic about the new chronotopes that emerged in and through the Middle Passage, slavery, and its resultant Black modernity, and what this means for writing Black histories. The roots of the formal academic study of history are firmly embedded in the Enlightenment project of empiricism, positivism, rationality, and possessive individualism. Indeed, it is my view that one of the ironies of the turn to the Black historical agent as the mover of history is the idea of agency, and by definition, the ability of the individual, the historical agent, to act independently of the context of overarching social, cultural, and political structures. This is a product of the Enlightenment project, a project that did not include, for the most part, non-white, non-Western peoples. We need thus to embrace a future of new historical methods that, again, also heed Paul Gilroy's famous and brilliant injunction that the Black Atlantic constitutes the dark side of the Enlightenment, a counterculture of modernity that long anticipated the conditions of modernity that we now call postmodern. And these insurgent methods must shape how we can begin to write about not broken people or helpless victims, but rather those who had to confront the crushing objecthood, to invoke Fanon yet again, that battered bodies and psyches, fracturing the subjectivities of those who survived and resisted the barbarous conditions of Black life that were forged in the context of the Black modern. The double consciousness that characterizes Black life under modernity can only be partially contained, captured, and embodied by the positivist and empiricist logic that structure the traditional historical archive. Future historians will have to develop an approach to writing history that is informed by principles of intersectionality, which I mentioned earlier, and what form that might take exactly is unclear. We talk about it a lot in our seminars, but I'm not sure we figured out how we're going to deal with the principles of intersectionality in terms of historical method and practice. I think that's an ongoing conversation. So what form that might take exactly is unclear to help us deal with the fractured black subject-object, as well as the compression of space and time that occurs under the conditions of slavery and post-slavery, and how again this affects conventional notions of historical progress. The lived experiences of black people also embody historically and spatially overlapping colonial projects. The practice of carding, for example, gestures to histories and practices of slavery and surveillance in Canada and the Caribbean, Jim Crow in its older and newer iterations, and the racialized deployment of state power upon people who embody the global South, regardless of their geographical location. In other words, newer historians of blackness in Canada and elsewhere will have to puzzle out how a discipline that is wedded to positivist notions of change over time can come to grips with the quote-unquote changing same of black life, or the over swaths of time where new iterations of white supremacy supplant the old to ensure the conditions that expedite black death. So in the last section, and I'm not going to go through the entire section, I do a little historical analysis, and this part I call Between Fugitivity and Colonization. So in this part of the paper, I talk about 3 case studies that, for me, exemplify the kind of liminal space that black Canadians occupied between, again, fugitivity and colonization. So David Theo Goldberg has argued that the history of the modern state and racial definition are intimately related. Race has always been central in Canadian state formation. The issue of slavery has been central to Canada's emergence as a modern state. Slavery was widely practiced in many parts of pre-Confederation Canada, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And scholarly traditional histories of blackness have moved us beyond the nation state as the primary lens through which to study black history. And this makes perfect sense given the intertwined histories of blackness in the Atlantic world and the circulation of black peoples through circuits that made up the Black Atlantic. Nonetheless, we need to think more critically about black Canadians' relationship to settler colonialism and the foundation of a racial state that has its genesis in the dispossession of Indigenous people. As Sanera Tabani brilliantly puts it in her work regarding the question of citizenship for non-white settlers, many of whom had been coerced into migration. Tabani says this: "Can a citizenship conceived in, maintained by, a genocidal violence leave untainted any group which comes to be included in its orbit? No matter how severe the forms of their own previous exclusions, or how tenuous their subsequent inclusions." In my own work, I have challenged the Promised Land myth, as I mentioned before, both in its historical and more recent and admittedly more nuanced iterations, in favor of thinking about the liminal space that blacks occupied, again, between legal equality and social ostracism. And I talk about this a lot in some of my previous work. But my work has not fully thought through how even the liminal status of black people made them not only not white citizens, but also not white settlers. Black people did not create the racial colonial state that we now inhabit, but they managed to carve out a tenuous hold within it. The significant commercial successes that some black men were able to amass were clearly only possible because of the racial state's criminal theft and appropriation of Indigenous land. But in the large scheme of things, black people were supplicants, getting the crumbs of white British Canadian imperialism when they did manage to own a piece of stolen land outright, as opposed to the just as common practice of blacks being placed on tickets of occupation. The well-documented differential treatment or discriminatory treatment of white and black loyalists and the shabby treatment of the refugees is a case in point, which I can talk about later if anybody's interested. What then to do with what I have elsewhere called the liminal space, again, between fugitivity and colonization? The unsteady ground between the ex-slave and the citizen, the fugitive and the settler. So in this part of the paper, I go into 3 case studies that highlight the complexities of thinking critically about black people's relationship to the racial state in Canada and this liminal space between fugitivity and colonization that shaped the contours of black experiences in Canada West, I talk about the colored convention movement. I look at excerpts from the narratives collected by Benjamin Drew, who toured Canada West in the 19th century and interviewed ex-slaves, and Marianne Shadd's 19th century colonization guide, A Plea for Immigration. So I'm going to end by looking at one of these examples. So consider the narrative of Ephraim Casey, a freeborn black man who migrated to Colchester, Ontario in the 19th century. Ephraim Casey's testimony was recorded in abolitionist Benjamin Drew's The Narrative of the Fugitive Slaves, originally published in 1856. In his narrative, Casey introduces himself as hailing from the state of Georgia. This is a quote from him, "where I was born free, but the laws were not better about learning for a free man than for a slave." At the age of 23, Casey continued, he emigrated to Indiana, quote unquote, carrying no property. Once in Indiana, Casey's fortunes seemed to have improved dramatically. From his propertyless status in the Cotton Belt, Indiana afforded him the opportunity to amass some land. A farm sprawling some 18 acres. Casey, nonetheless, decided to leave. And he says, "I liked the country very well. The laws bore hard on me before I came away. I had a farm there, and when I left, I owned 118 acres. I left on principle on account of the laws. The laws bore down hard on me before I came away. I had a case in law and could not prove my side good by the evidence of being colored, which caused me a loss of $50 or $60. I did not feel disposed to stand this and emigrated to Canada." Once in Canada, Casey settled in Colchester, where he, quote, bought out a white settler, Landon stock, for $750. After having made vast improvements on his newly purchased land, including a new irrigation system, a well, and even a sawmill, Casey's fortunes had improved so much he was able to, quote, hire colored men to work for me whenever I wanted their help, and I have seen them hired by others, end of quote. Casey continued, but they prefer, so far as I know, to work for themselves, to get an independent living. Casey's narrative, though brief, is quite rich. It tells us about the nature and elasticity of fugitivity as an analytical category. And it corroborates Michael Wayne's classic findings that many black people fled bondage. That while many blacks fled bondage, in fact, more fled conditions of unfreedom rather than slavery qua slavery. It also gives us a window, albeit limited, on the complex relationship amongst coloniality, race, land, accumulation, and citizenship. Casey's ability to convert land to capital and leverage capital for substantive citizenship was compromised in the United States because of the overt nature of white supremacy in the form of unequal justice in the courts. Once in Canada, the alchemies of race, citizenship, and capital accumulation changed, allowing him to exercise his property rights in the purchase of land from a white settler, and the protection of the law to conduct business, hire employees, and accumulate capital. Nonetheless, like so many such narratives, it is silent on the transfer of land from indigenous peoples. Colchester's settler colonial origins began in the 18th century with a series of land purchases and treaties. In the post-revolutionary era, William Caldwell, a British captain, secured a quote-unquote grant from indigenous peoples and immediately set about preparing the land for soldiers come settlers, and the details about how Caldwell secured the land is unclear. In 1787, a man named Thomas Smith, a surveyor, surveyed land nearby the Caldwell Grant, which was joined with it. A few years later, in 1790, a Detroit-based Indian agent, Alexander McGee, through which, quote, the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Huron Indians, that transferred over 1.3 million acres of land to settlers. This land was exchanged for, quote, valuable land and merchandise, including blankets, combs, looking glasses, penknives, ribbons, silk handkerchief, hats, tobacco, and rum, worth £1,200. The treaty stipulated that the crown was, quote, to have and to hold the said lands and premises hereby given and granted, mentioned or intended to be given and graded until His Majesty George III, his heirs and successors forever. The treaty, like scores of others that came before it, and those that would follow, marked the essence of the contract that converted indigenous land to lots divided by concessions, lines on maps that made settler space and turned land into fungible and alienable property. It was this act of exchange, often conducted under highly dubious circumstances, with more than a whiff of the coercive power of the colonial state, that created the conditions under which black people could escape their unfreedom and try to begin life anew. So in the earlier part of the paper, or the earlier part of this section, I asked the question of whether or not it is possible for people who are stolen to achieve the possibilities of full freedom on stolen land. And that, I think, is the central conundrum that faced black settlers then and now. In conclusion, this brief essay has attempted, through a study of historiography, method and practice, to engage in a discussion of writing Black Canadian history that continues to move us beyond simple storytelling, fact-gathering, and archival spadework. While all of these elements are important aspects of the historian's craft, we must continue to build upon and go beyond these facets to explore the complex relationships between colonization, blackness, fugivity, and the modern Canadian racial state. Lastly, in these perilous times, again I return to the question of what is it we want the writing of Black history to do? How can it help to secure the liberation of Black people from the terror of the racial state? Does the historian of Black Canada, in other words, have the luxury of writing history for history's sake? Thank you.
Thank you, Barrington. That was a wonderful talk. I was fascinated by your connection with Black history and Indigenous history. The one example, the guy who settled in Colchester. And I was just wondering, to what extent is this new in the historiography of Black Canada to look at it, Indigenous and Blackness together, or is it been there from the beginning?
And I wouldn't say it's been there from the beginning, nor would I say it's new. And indeed, there is a much more kind of rich and substantive discussion of the relationship between these relationships that actually occurred outside of history. And that's another issue, I guess. It's not me complaining or lamenting, but often it seems that historians are kind of left out of some of these interesting conversations that take place around history and around the historical relationships and the complexities of these sorts of relationships. So I would say that for the most part, in the writing of Black Canadian history, if you read a book like, again, The Blacks in Canada, which is quite a dated book now, and a lot of the books that came after that, the writing of the presence of Indigenous people is simply not there. There isn't a sustained discussion about coloniality and how it is exactly that. Well, there's a discussion of how Black people arrived there, but there really isn't a sustained discussion of, okay, who inhabited this space before, and what does this mean for framing the conditions of Black freedom? And there was, I would say that in the last maybe 10 years or so, there have been more and more scholars that have been willing to look at this issue. So it's not new. I'm not saying I'm the first one to discuss these issues, but you can see a kind of turn towards discussing them. But again, even in the context of that discussion, one has to be careful, right? So one has to be careful about the way in which one talks about the relationship that black people have to the white settler colonial project. It's not as easy as saying, well, you know, these are settlers too, but they're just black. It's, I tried to convey in the talk, it is more complicated. So to say it sort of more, I'm not up here trying to crack jokes or anything, but my partner has a pretty good friend, and she's, you know, her politics are passionate. She's an indigenous woman, and you know, she said something to me in my home, and she said something like, "Be quiet, you settler," right? That's something that she just, as a joke, "Be quiet, settler." And I looked at her and I said, "I'm not a settler. I'm an emancipated slave." Right. So that is the crux of the issue that I'm trying to frame, right? Am I a settler? Yes and no. Yes, Hina?
So I really appreciated, like, especially, like, the entire talk, but especially, like, the very end, where you're engaging, like, not past or study, but, like, just, yeah, like, indigenous histories with, like, histories of other, like, people of color moving through land, and, like, sort of people of color's own, not complicity, but I guess you could say that in some respects, in dispossession. And I noticed that there's a lot of crossover with, like, the particular context that I look at in South Africa. So and like these questions are being raised and debated in the context of like, what is the place of ex-indentured, like, Indian settlers in the Caribbean, and in, like, places like South Africa and other places where like, again, like, migration is arguably in some respects, like, coerced, but also one's, like, complicity in those particular, like, structures of settler colonialism in those areas. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe not the universality of this, but just the how. Well, maybe I want to learn a little bit more about what you would say is maybe, like, particular to the Canadian context, or, like, I guess the Commonwealth context in that respect, because I think this is something that's happening in places like Australia and New Zealand as well. Maybe, but with, like, Asian migration, or, like, Asian, like, labor migration as well, in some respects. I don't know. But also, yeah, so I guess, like, what do you see as maybe the wider histories of this, but also, like, what would you say is, like, very particular to sort of Canadian context in this respect? Or this is a big question.
That is a very big question. I think that there is kind of a broader imperial, colonial, British imperial context that you rightly hit on. You know, there's a recent history that's just been published on unfree labor, a global history of unfree labor, and I think it's an important project. Marcus Rediker and his friends published this thing, and I think it's an important category of analysis, talking about indentured. Were you one of his friends in that collection that we talked about? No. I thought maybe you were. You know, I think it's an important, I think, analytical framework, looking at the circulation of unfree people around the globe, and their various contacts with indigenous people, and what that means from the standpoint of indigenous people, and thinking through complicity, which isn't quite the right word when you're talking about people who are coerced, and about coerced labor. I do think that there is something about, and I will say, about the specificity of people who are enslaved, right? So not people who are in sort of labor contracts, or people who are, you know, very poorly, highly repressed, poorly paid workers, but people who are actually commodities themselves, right? And people who try to make that move from being fungible property and commodities to trying to achieve full citizenship, right? They we have that farthest distance to travel in terms of having our full humanity realized. And that is the argument that I would make, and I would invite pushback, right, in terms of the discourse around unfree labor in the world. I think that's part of what links folks in the African diaspora, and I think that there are linkages, at least in the British imperial world, which I would say the most familiar with, right, that would link the experiences of, say, blacks in, the early Americas, as well as the Caribbean. I can't speak to, and I think most historians are a little uncomfortable, I guess, with speaking to kind of the universalist dimensions of what I just laid out with people of African descent in Canada vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples, because I think, while I think your question is important, and I'm not trying to dodge it, important but difficult, I think there are important kind of diasporic and cross-national issues at play here. I think one really has to pay attention to national context, local context, and specificities, rather than trying to paint too broad a brush. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I can certainly try again after the Q&A. So I guess I would push back a little bit about the necessity to come up with these kinds of overarching conversations that are global with regard to the histories of unfree people and Indigenous people. I would ask, I'm not trying to answer a question with a question, but what exactly does that get us in terms of uncovering the past? Stephen?
So I was really interested in the short part that when you discussed like embodied archives or the body as archive. And I think I was drawing parallels in my mind with queer history, because I think that the notion of the body as archive is extremely relevant to the study of queer history.